about halfway through this, but I realize I got to pick up the pace a little bit so you get out of here on time and we have time for questions. Okay, corn. All right, we call it corn, but it's actually, corn is a generic name for, there we go. Thank you. Corn is actually a generic name for grains, okay? Another thing I like to tell you as your in-house nutrition educator, if you have corn on your plate, it's not a vegetable, it's a grain. So if you have like corn and bread and a piece of meat, you are eating 2 grains. And now it does have fiber, it does have, like zeanthins and all kinds of like lovely things in it, but it is a grain, it is not a vegetable. I don't care what the USDA says. So grains are the seeds of grasses, and corn is like basically almost the largest grass in the world, at least a grain generating one. But it wasn't always the biggest one in the world, we just made it like that. Okay, so warm season, definitely new worlds. And I love this picture for this diversity of corn, but if you get a second and you haven't seen, like look up the Baker Creek gem corn. It was like on the cover a few years ago. It looks like jewelry. It is so beautiful. Yeah, I love it. If you are gonna grow corn in your garden, recognize you have to grow it in a block because it is wind pollinated. It's not self-pollinating, or bees don't visit it and pollinate. And each silk, the hairy part that comes out of the top of the corn when you're peeling it back, each one of those silks connects to one individual corn kernel. So if you open up corn and there's missing kernels, that means that that particular silk was not touched by pollen. So it's just something to keep in mind. But that's why you plant it in a block, because when the wind blows, the pollen falls down onto the silks, okay? So don't plant it in a row. You can plant it in a row. Like when I lived in the desert, I did this, so when I looked out my backyard, it was green because everywhere else was like brown outside of that. And it looked like I was in the jungle or something. But I wasn't expecting to get any corn out of it. But if you're like, oh, I gotta grow corn just to do it, grow a few corn and then go out there and hand pollinate it and you'll be fine. Okay, so that's a lot of words. I hate so many words on a slide, but let's go through it. Okay, so people, like, especially Mexico, they are people of the corn. Like, the domestication that they have done with corn is, I mean, completely amazing. And we'll look at teosinte and corn, sort of like how that they changed this over time. So it was domesticated 9,000 years ago during the movement and traveling. And teosinte actually, corn today is called a cultigen, and there are a lot of plants like this that it will not grow on its own now. It has been so manipulated by man that it must be physically planted by us. So like a corn cob is not gonna fall and hit the ground and you're gonna have all this perfect corn coming. Where usually grains like wheat or teosinte or any of those kind of grains, they'll have like shattering, that's what they call it, where the sort of, the seed pod will naturally kind of explode when the wind hits it so that it can spread its seed. Any of the grains that we have bred over time, whether it's wheat or oats or anything like that, are now, the modern varieties are cultigens, because what humans have done, because when you go through that field, you don't want those exploding randomly. We have selected for the ones that hold together so that they don't explode, because we want that seed for our bread or our tortillas or our porridge. We don't want it all over the ground. We want to be able to choose. So the older varieties have grains that will actually shatter, and the newer, more modern varieties, we've bred them so now they're cultigens. They won't shatter on their own, and we have to plant them, and corn is the same way. So there was a parallel evolution in Mexico and South America. Of course, these were like, the wanderings of peoples, or there was trade. And at some point early on in corn's domestication, it was split up, and then there was this happens a lot actually, especially when we get into some of the old world crops in about a half hour, where people got a hold of these seeds through one way or another, and then they live in different areas, they planted them, and then there was a parallel evolution where one went this way, one went another way, even to the point of them being different species sometimes. So just something to keep in mind. The Olmec and the Maya most likely develops nixtamalization. So some of you know what that is, but if you don't, let me tell you. So nixtamalization is the ability, is basically taking corn kernels, dent corn or flint corn, which is the corn we use to feed animals, make ethanol, make cornmeal. This is made out of flint or dent corn. It's a hard field corn, okay? And it's nutritious, it's got, fiber and all these sorts of things, but if I get this wet, I can't knead it into a dough. And so what the ancient civilizations of Mexico and South America figured out is to make, and don't worry about the brand names, I am a representative of North Carolina State University and I'm not allowed to promote any particular brand. So, so ignore the brand on this, but this is nixtamal, which is a nixtamalized form of corn. And that's where you take that dent corn and you expose it to, yes?
You say dent, like D-E-N?
Dent, yeah, so it's a hard corn with a little dent in it. I should have had a picture up here for you. But dent corn and flint corn are very similar. That's what makes corn flour or cornmeal, okay? Or also we take that corn and we chop up all the stalks of the corn we're on. And if you go to like a concentrated animal feeding operation, like a big cow finishing area where there's thousands of cows, you'll see these mountains covered in tarps. And what they do is they take the corn, they chop up all the stalks that it grew on, and they mix it all up and they put it underneath these tarps and they pre-digest it to feed it to cows. So this is like animal feed. We also make it into ethanol, we make it into plastics, the corn oil that we use, and corn protein and cornstarch in some of the delicious snacks we had in a bag over there, like your Fritos, all that kind of stuff, all the ingredients that we use corn for comes from dent or flint corn, okay? And so does cornmeal. So what these ancient civilizations figured out is you can take that corn, soak it in water and an alkaline substance. Some of them used wood ash, some used soda ash, some took a chunk of limestone and threw it in the boiling water, and you basically cook this corn and it releases the pericarp, which is the outside covering. We call it the bran when you're talking about like a oat or wheat. There's the bran and then the endosperm on the inside and then the germ, which is where which I wish I had the diagram, usually I'm teaching this on a diagram, but it's called a pericarp on corn. So if you've ever been to a place that makes tortillas from scratch, if they make nixtamal from scratch, they're just these vats, like gigantic bathtubs full of, they use cal, which is calcium hydroxide. It's an alkaline substance. You soak it in this like almost boiling water overnight and it releases the pericarp of the corn. So now you just have the endosperm and the germ still attached. You can see it on popcorn. You know how like when you pop popcorn and it turns inside out? The kind of brown part that's turned inside out is the pericarp. The fluffy white part is the endosperm, and the little point on the end that sometimes like gets stuck in your throat when you're eating popcorn, those are all the three parts of the corn. Anyway, what they figured out is that they soak it in an alkaline substance, it softens the hemicellulose of the corn, and it makes it so you can knead it. I don't know if any of you have ever made tortillas from scratch or seen them made, but you can't take cornmeal and mix it and then knead it into a dough. It's more like you can make like a stiff batter out of it, but you can't knead it. But this allows you to knead it. It also makes it more nutritious because that hemicellulose binds niacin, which is vitamin B3. And if you nixtamalize it like this, it liberates that B vitamin from the hemicellulose in the corn and actually makes it more nutritious. So the B3 deficiency disease is called pellagra, and it prevents that because you're actually, rather than it passing right through you, because hemicellulose is a fiber and we don't have the ability to digest fiber, it passes right through us. So does that vitamin B3, but they figured out how, I'm sure they did not know that was what it was, but the ability to be able to knead the flour and make it into tortillas, to make it into bread, you cannot do that with cornmeal. You can make like delicious cornbread, I love that too, but you can't make tortillas out of it. And this is what they figured out how to do. So, okay. That's nixtamalization, all right. But if you want to do that, you gotta buy, let me show you, I'll get to it in a second, I'll show you where that's at. Okay, so the Spanish traders carried it back to Europe, but they feared consuming it because they thought that they would become Indian, because they called everybody Indians, because they thought they were in India, and they weren't. There's a couple of things that come up biblically, which I think is kind of hilarious. So if you hear any crops mentioned in the Bible, which a couple of them come up later on, there's no word of corn or potatoes anywhere because that's the old world. Like they thought the world was flat and it was all on that all east of the Atlantic Ocean. So because of that, for those of you out there, when people take communion, it's called transubstantiation when the priest does the blessing on the little cracker, and then, I'm sorry, I don't mean to offend anybody if you're Catholic, but they do the blessing, and there's this process called transubstantiation where that becomes the body of Christ, in their tradition. People out there were afraid, they didn't really have access to wheat because wheat hadn't been come over and been planted everywhere yet, and so they were afraid that A, they were going to become Indians, and B, that they couldn't take communion because it couldn't be made out of corn, it had to be made out of wheat because corn wasn't in the Bible. A whole lot of drama over these foods because of what's listed in the Bible and not. It was pretty fascinating. It came up quite a few times in my research. So it spread to Italy and West Africa in the 16th century. It was a really popular peasant food because it grew like super, super well because corn is very adaptable. And if anybody's ever had like polenta in Italy, that is made from cornmeal. It's not nixtamalized, but delicious. Let's see, which is basically a lot of our corn grits here. When we eat grits, that's just regular cornmeal. It's not nixtamalized. Florida was the first place in the current U.S. to cultivate it because way before, the Nina Pinta and Santa Maria and the, Mayflower and all them came over, the Spanish, long before that, were in Florida. That was Spanish territory. Florida means flowered because when they saw the place, it was covered in flowers. It was a huge tropical peninsula. So sweet corn is actually around like somewhere in the 1750s. The Iroquois tribe actually was growing corn that they had traded with Europeans, I'm sure, and they had a mutation happen in their field, and they came up with sweet corn. And so the Iroquois were the ones who figured this out and actually traded it with European settlers. The reason it was so popular is just like potatoes, corn produces 2 to 3 times more calories per acre of land at that time, let alone now with the genetically modified crops that we have now and the GPS John Deere tractors that can plant from fence row to fence row. Even when they were planting more sparsely and by hand, it was still 2 to 3 times the calories that you could get with corn than you could with wheat. Oh, somebody raise their hand? No? Okay. Okay. So corn, currently, at our current consumption rates, 6% of the calories in the world that are consumed are corn. But it's the #1 grain grown in the world because we use it for way more things than consumption. So, and if you can think about, okay, corn and soybeans, like you can separate out, the reason they're so popular in snack foods and consumed everywhere is because you can take corn and soybeans and split them up into their component parts, their oil, and their proteins primarily, oils, proteins, and starches. And then you can like reconfigure those magically into any like flavor, any shape. If you could think of all the interesting shapes of snacks, I mean, we just had those like delicious, I don't think there's any corn in those, but those little like straws we were eating, you can have like a straw, you're eating like potato starch that has a hole in it, or like all the different shapes of like the scoops and the dips and the, and that's because of the machinations of being able to break these things down into component parts and remix them together for exactly like the taste and texture, shipping capability, all that kind of thing. So corn kind of is like a modern miracle. But we use it for ethanol. Ethanol is alcohol that we would drink as well, but we use it to dilute gasoline. So we're not using as many fossil fuels, silage. The oil makes plastics. We use it for food. It's really medicines. I mean, corn is completely amazing. But just like the cautionary tale of the Irish potato famine, we do have to be really careful because we are planted all through the Midwest with like one kind of corn. So just, something to keep in mind. That it is a cautionary tale that is worrying that there are just monocrops of statewide, corn usage, but we use it a lot.
And genetically modified.
Yes, and that's a conversation for a whole nother thing for sure. Okay, so this is kind of modern maize here. It's not, we're calling it corn, but the rest of the world calls it maize or maíz because that specifically means this plant. Whereas corn, and that just meant any kind of grain. It's just in America we call it corn. But this is the older plant teosinte. So this, I mean, look at that. Like the fact that they were able to figure this, these ancient communities figured out that this is food, and went from here to here is amazing. And then also, this is primitive corn, like that's actual corn, and they kept breeding it and breeding it and breeding it, and now we have these like large, beautiful corn cobs, and you know, that only happened in a matter of a couple thousand years, and we did it as humans. Yes?
Was it clear what the mutation was when they made sweet corn?
I don't know. That would be a genetic question, and there's your geneticist right here. I'm sure that they did not have like, you know, that kind of technology to be able to see what it was, but I'm sure that there was some sort of genetic. Yes, please.
Sorry, so corn is actually really fascinating, and of all the crops, it is the one that has inspired the most phenomenal genetic work. They have a pretty strong understanding of how you get from teosinte to maize, of how different types of genes have been mapped in corn, like all the different colors you see in corn kernels. It's actually like, if you ever want to dive into corn genetics, it's fascinating and so much work has been done on it. It's actually like kind of a model for a lot of other plant genetic systems, is just what we've learned from corn. Like corn supports agriculture, corn supports a lot of science too, just in terms of what we've been able to figure out. It's really
But that kind of a genetic change, would that be an internal genetic change, or is something external that happened to it?
probably most of that kind of stuff is internal, and the interesting thing about it too is that a lot of times whatever that mutation was, it actually existed for a very long time in the population, and then just for some reason it comes to a higher density, or it combines with other mutations, and that's where you actually see it happening. So like, just, I'll finish, but like, for example, all the research I did in grad school, the final mapping I did with genomics was based off of tools developed for corn, right? Like, it has created tools for genomic mapping, it has created tools for so many different things, because you have so many good labs working on this.
That's what a PhD in genetics will get you. Awesome.
Sorry.
No, just I'm like, hey. One little genetic thing, like when I was in high school, my dad sent me to a summer camp called Women in Science and Engineering, WISE, and I spent a week with a corn geneticist actually, and she showed me like gel electrophoresis and how they do it. But I thought what was really cute is that they planted these big blocks of corn for their research, and they had to make like a big border around the outside of it of sweet corn because people kept stealing their research. So they would do a border of sweet corn. Anyway, oh my God, that totally reminded me of that. I haven't thought about that in forever. Thank you. Okay, so, nixtamalization, we talked about this. But this, again, don't pay attention. This is just a very common variety, but any of them that you get in the same section. Usually the cornmeal is not right next to this. It's like spaced out a little bit. But this is how you make corn tortillas. Very easy to make, by the way. It's like water, this stuff or that stuff, and salt, and a press, and it's very easy. If you've ever made your own, you'll never buy them again because they're so easy to make and so quick. And then the cornmeal that we know that we use, again, ignore the name brand, any kind will work. Is different. Common beans. Okay, so this one we're gonna blaze through, but this is so fascinating because remember how I was saying that there's like a grain and a bean caused these areas where people could actually settle down. They didn't have to depend on animals, even though animals were a big part of this. So, real quick, when we say something is like natural or unnatural, and I know like there's some paleo diet is really popular, and keto diet and all of that, and I'm here for all of that. Any questions you have about it, whatever diet works for you is great. However, when you think about like how cold things are up here and how short the growing season is at all, or large portions of grassland where there are no fruit trees and things, we had to partner with animals to go anywhere here. There's not, so like a paleo diet is great, but like just eating fruits and vegetables and meat, if that was the only thing that we ever ate, we would have never come down out of the trees. We it took partnership with animals to be able to move up here. Now, with the modern technology, some of the agriculture, controlled environment agriculture going on in these countries right here will blow your mind. Could be another 3-hour talk. But in order now, before, when we, hunters, gatherers, and even when we wanted to make settlements, we had to partner with animals because we had a very short growing window. We had to have a way to store food, and a big part of that was the storage in the body of animals. So milk, meat, eggs, things like that. So just something to keep in mind. This is like the beautiful temperate region here where, we're fine because we freeze for a little bit but not too long or not at all. But anywhere up here or down here, there's a lot of partnership with animals that went on. Okay, going back to it. All right. Beans. Okay, so the reason that I picked these is because these are common beans. There was a whole other world of legumes on the other side of the world. So these are all the New World beans, okay? And pretty much all of these beans can be eaten as green beans. Green beans, we're not usually growing pinto beans like in our garden, but if you are growing any kind of beans and you wanted to save seeds for the next year, you leave them there, they mature and they dry and they're gonna be big and you can cook them like these beans. So pretty much all the beans that we know that we grow here as green beans are these American common beans. Excuse me. So we were talking about the complete amino acids we were talking about. Having to have a bean and a grain to have all of the amino acids that we need to survive. They were native to Mesoamerica, of course. They arrived in Europe in the 16th century, 40 years after Columbus. So Columbus, again, he came through first. It was like, hey, you guys, there's like land over here, and I think it's India. And everybody like got on boats and they came over and made lives here. So and traded. But he did note when he visited what we call Cuba today, they have cowpeas and broad beans more diverse than our own. So lima beans have 2 centers of domestication in South America. Again, there was probably some kind of trade. They took these beans and planted them and naturally selected, not naturally, but humanly selected the very best ones and kept growing them and growing them. And so where you can find in the centers of centers of origination, where these two joined together at one point as a common ancestor, when they split up in different areas, they had a parallel evolution into 2 completely different things. So just a little note on growing beans if you've never done it before. It was the same seed company, I think it's like, I wrote it on here, High Mowing Seeds, I think. I did put a thing down there. Anyway, this is a bush bean. You see how they're bending over to pick it? That's a bush bean, okay? This, I probably come up to his shoulder, so that is a pole bean. Okay, so that's something that you want to look for when you want to put beans in. Sometimes I'll grow pole beans, but if I have a trellis, there's like lots of other things that I want to grow on a trellis. Like chayote and all kinds of things, different tomatoes, crazy different kinds of cucumbers that don't get bitter in the middle of the heat. So I don't usually grow pole beans. I usually grow bush beans because they're easy. You can fit them in all over the place, But just so you know, you're like, I want to grow green beans. Make sure that you know which one that you're getting, and they always list it, okay? If you've never grown them before. Peas. Okay, so now we're going into cool season, but I feel like I skipped over Old World beans. That's right. I was like, there was an Old World one in here. So a lot of the Old World beans we're not going to grow because they're things like lentils. Like you need a field of lentils to get enough lentils to make a soup, But I wanted to mention them because there was an exchange. This is where there was actually an exchange where we sent our beans and they brought their beans. And then we ended up having this exchange. Lentils are great because you don't have to think ahead to cook them when they're dry. We just did a cooking class with 100 families where we gave them boxes of food and then I cooked online. It was super fun. Just so you know, if you're cooking, like I keep lentils around all the time because you could get home and be like, oh God, I gotta serve dinner, and lentils will be done in 30 minutes. You don't need the soaking and the cooking for 3 hours. So just quickly, chickpeas are native to Turkey, of course, like hummus for days, so good. Fava or broad beans are also a native ancestor. They're so old, like they can't even figure out where they came from. There's a lot of old world crops like that. There was so much trade for so long, they can't even figure out where across that Silk Road it even started. I wanted to show you these because I know that you're esteemed leader here, and I feel the same way about fava beans. Fava beans are so beautiful to grow. You don't have to stake them. They get about this tall, and look at these flowers. I mean, even just to grow them for the flowers is so beautiful. They don't get very tall, and they're super easy, and they're just gorgeous. You can even grow them as an ornamental if you like. But some people are susceptible to favism, which is, it can cause anemia. It causes your red blood cells basically to explode. It's not that common. And I think if you eat one meal of them, you probably would not even notice. It's people who like base their diet on it, or if they're, I know that there's like genetically, in the ancient lands, like some Hebrew people, they're susceptible genetically to favism. So something to just keep in mind that some people are susceptible to that. But we're not dependent on one source of being for every single meal, so, but just something to keep in mind. Lentils are native to the Fertile Crescent, cowpeas are native to Africa, soybeans are native to China, and they arrived over here at different times. It just depends on when people came over. It was a big mixing. Yes?
Does succotash, which is beans and corn, does that satisfy the grain?
Yep. Beans and corn together are, yep, exactly. So beans and corn are a complete protein. Yep. Peanut butter and bread, complete protein. Yep. Okay. Peas. Peas you can start actually putting in now because they're frost tolerant. Old World, Pisum sativum. So this is actually one of the world's earliest cultivated vegetables that we know about. And I had to include him right there, got to. Old Greg and his peas, if you took Biology 101, you gotta learn that he was the father of modern genetics. I almost didn't include him. I'm like, this is Ashley's class, I have to include him. She's a geneticist. She'd be like, where's Gregor? Where's Professor Mendel? So there he is. And if you don't know about him, look him up. He basically figured out by breeding different peas, being able to figure out dominant and recessive alleles, and so it's very interesting. So this is one of the old world's earliest cultivated vegetables, and it's spread all across the old world. They don't exactly know but Greece, Syria, Turkey, Iraq, and Jordan, right around that area, very dry, but also lots of water available, is most likely where they have the most genetic diversity in the wild populations, is kind of where they guess it started, and that's how they do it with all crops when they're studying their genetics. But Swiss and Hungarian archaeological digs found them 5,000 years ago. What often happens in these really old societies that were developed and civilized or whatever in cities, they'll move a house and you're go to build something and there's a whole house underneath it that got buried over for some reason, and they found peas there as well. The Aryans of West Asia introduced them to the Greeks and Romans, and the Norman conquest brought peas to England, resulting in today's mushy peas. So mushy peas are classic English fare, and they're what do they call them? Marrow fat peas, these specific peas that they make mushy peas out of. And the French got them in the 16th century, and then the Irish settlers, they brought them to the American colonies when they came over. I mean, think about it. They dry really easily. The seed lasts a while, and they're also really easy to You can eat some of them green, and then some of them you can shell, depending on the type of pea that you get. And then it's very easy to dry that seed and keep it for the following year. But they're a spring vegetable, they're easy to grow, and there's 3 basic types, okay? You need a trellis. You see these little tendrils here? If you don't give them a trellis, they're gonna grip onto anything around them. So just be aware of that it'll be crawling over your lettuce, or if you've got a small tomato there, it'll grab a hold of it and drag it down with them. So give them something to climb, and they'll be a lot happier with you. But you can since they have these tendrils, you can just put them next to a fence and they'll grow. They're one of the few things in the fall and in the spring that get really tall. So it's kind of neat, like in the fall, like if you know Peter Bensped, he was growing, it's the only thing that's really tall because normally across the garden all you can see are these short greens throughout the winter. But he grows a spring crop and a fall crop and they chase up this trellis. And so it's like the only tall and very green, beautiful thing, but they can handle a frost. They can't handle like a deep freeze of 7 degrees, 9 degrees, 8 degrees on each successive night like we had just recently, but they can definitely handle spring frost with no problem. This is a sugar snap pea, that's a snow pea. So a snow pea you pick when the peas are really tiny inside and you eat the entire pod. Sugar snap peas, they're a little bit bigger on the inside. What humans have tried to do over time is to breed out this little, I don't know what you call it, it's like a, what is it, stringless? Yeah, it's a string, they call it a string. But there's the end of its string and you strip this off and it makes it more tender. But over time we've bred them to either not have that string or that fiber is so small that you don't really notice it and it's more toothsome. And then these are shelling peas, where if you pick them young enough, you could probably eat the pod, but they're always going to have one heck of a string on them, and they're mainly made to pick young, but to eat the fresh peas. Yes?
I think I've had a problem in the past with peas cross-pollinating if I don't keep them far enough apart. Like I plant, different type, but if I put them too close, they all become one.
Huh.
I wonder if
Wait, that would be second generation, though, wouldn't it?
yeah, maybe something is out competing the other thing. So like what is actually happening is you're planting them close together and then one or two of them are really strong varieties and they're basically out competing the other varieties and then you're not seeing the other varieties. But cross-pollination you would see when you collected those seeds and then planted them again.
Planted in the second year. Yeah.
Cheryl, do fava beans need a trellis?
No.
No.
No. If they get tall enough and heavy enough, they'll fall over. But really, they, let's see.
And they need a full day's sun?
Oh yeah, pretty much anything does. Yeah, except for lettuce or, anything that's just growing like a leaf or something, because technically this is a fruit. So it needs sun.
Somehow at 4.5 hours of afternoon sun, I can grow cucumbers and they love it for some reason.
'Cause
And
it's a
some
summer.
cherry tomato, but other than that,
And they're tropicals. So, yeah. And we're going to get into that right now. Okay. Oh, first talk about peanuts. Okay. Arachis hypogea. I'm terrible at pronouncing these because I only ever read them. Okay. So, native to South America, of course. Okay. Found in pre-Columbian Peruvian mummy bundles. So this is a very valuable food. Spanish and Portuguese colonized South America. Peanuts spread into Mexico. So one thing I forgot to show you is way up in the pepper, the pepper one where I had the map with the varieties. There's a line. Let me just draw it over here so we don't waste time. There was a treaty where they just basically went from Greenland and was like, okay, we're going to divide the world up, and this is Spanish and this is Portuguese. So if you want to know who came over and colonized land, you can just ask yourself what language do they speak today, and they speak Portuguese in Portugal and in Brazil. But this was the initial line, like, okay, here you go. It's just interesting how humans will do that. Like, all right, even us, like, here's this line, and this is us, and this is you, and here's this line. It's just really interesting to be studying about this, where it's like, here's this line, and the Portuguese traders, this is yours, and then this is all of Spain. But anyway, yeah. So they colonized South America, and then they by then had spread things into Mexico, because they didn't just, they started in South America, but then went all the way up through Mexico. They also traded peanuts in Europe and West Africa. And there's an anglicized word that we call goober, but it's actually a Bantu word, naguba, and we anglicize that to goober. So there's even like I think there's a candy bar called a goober even today. So they arrived in the American South with enslaved Africans, and a lot of the time that was the only food they had to eat on the Middle Passage, which, I mean, I like peanuts, but man, I mean, what a horrible experience, and all you could eat was peanuts the entire time, if you had food at all. So not normally consumed by whites in American colonies, they considered it food for livestock, which is also awful because they considered these people livestock, which is terrible. Roasted peanuts became popular among whites during the Civil War because they roasted them and then sold them in circuses and baseball games, like the cheap seats up above. So then they actually became popular among whites in the South. And NCSU has a renowned peanut lab, also a renowned sweet potato lab, which we'll get to. Ooh, well, we gotta talk about this guy. Happy Black History Month, everybody. So people think George Washington Carver made peanut butter first. He actually didn't. He did way more than that. There's like 3 guys, one of them's Canadian, and I think one's English and one's an American, that are fighting over who was the first one to create peanut butter. George Washington Carver was actually, he worked and researched at the Tuskegee Institute, and he was like amazing agriculture person, and he promoted soil health and maximization of food security in sharecroppers across the South. So there were a lot of black communities that had land, they were sharecropping, and what they would do is plant cotton, and you know, the sharecropping structure that they had with landowners, they would basically grow cotton to go into the market and make no money off of it and owe more money than the stuff that they sold. That's how they kept people, even though slavery was illegal, they kept people in servitude forever, because basically it was like they were the company's store and you always owed them, the landowners. And so what he did, this is the publication that he wrote, How to Grow the Peanut and 105 Ways of Preparing It for Human Consumption. He encouraged black farmers to grow cotton, do your business like you normally do, but in the off season, grow things like sweet potatoes and peanuts, especially peanuts because it's a legume, and so it traps atmospheric nitrogen, and it traps it in the body of the plant. And so if you grow peanuts, you get a food crop off of it, so that stores really well during lean times, and then all of these ways that you can prepare it for human consumption so that you would have stores of food, so whether or not you were able to pay the landlord everything that you owed them because of the unfair system that you were a part of, you would at least have food for your family, and you would enrich the soil so that as you continue to grow those cotton crops, you wouldn't deplete the soil to the point that you wouldn't get a crop. So he also encouraged interplanting with sweet potatoes as well, so he comes up again in this, which is good. All legumes, if I haven't mentioned it before, are nitrogen fixers, like I was saying. There's rhizobia in their roots. You can kind of actually see them here. Here's the roots, but there's like these little nodules that they live in, and it's a symbiotic relationship where they will, it's very difficult to get atmospheric nitrogen to break apart, which is why we use a lot of fossil fuels to make chemical fertilizer, or inorganic fertilizer. But this rhizobia has the ability to do that. So it will splice nitrogen, and it will feed it to the plant, and the plant, with its little leaves, which are like solar panels, traps light and uses it it breathes in carbon dioxide and uses water to make carbohydrates with the power of the sun and feeds it to the rhizobia. So it's this nice little symbiotic relationship that it's got. And so that also relates to human nutrition, because when we think about starch that we eat, that's carbohydrates, that's our carbon and hydrogen groups. But protein is all nitrogen groups. So it's this like cycle of nitrogen into us, nitrogen out of us and into plants. And so we get that's why you can get energy from starches, but you need all of, like, if you look at pictures like of the chemical shapes or chemical formulas of amino acids, they're full of nitrogen. So that's why these are protein-rich plants. They're full of nitrogen. It's mainly because of that rhizobia. So anyway, if you want to grow like cover crops or any of these kinds of things, it isn't that you can just pick them up and then take the green matter and throw it out and the nitrogen's in the soil. It's actually trapped in the plant, so you got to chop it up and leave it on the surface of the soil for it to break down and go back into the soil. Does that make sense? So it's like this circular nitrogen thing between us and animals and the earth. Yeah.
Okay, can I have one thing about George Washington Carver?
Please.
So George Washington Carver also was really, really phenomenal in that he did all this research, but then he would have these like Carver-mobiles where he would kit out these wagons and everything else so he could take it out into the fields to show it to people. And so a lot of his work is one of the early inspirations for extension, actually.
That's so cool. I did not know that. I
He was
love
doing
it.
before, like,
you can see how peanut butter was like not that big of a deal compared to what this guy did. He did so many things. Okay. The cucurbits, one of my favorite families. Some are, they're warm season, but some are old world and some are new world. Okay. But look at that variety. Thank you, Baker Creek. I love taking pictures from them because they're beautiful, varied, and I only have to put one credit at the bottom of the slide. Self-serving. Okay. All right. All right, so squash, New World, okay? This is one of the oldest cultivated crops, and you could probably understand why. I didn't read this anywhere. I just put myself in the mind of a hunter-gatherer. If I'm like traipsing through the forest or wherever I'm hunting and gathering on a loop around a large section of land, because it'll be warmer during some part of the year somewhere, or the fish come in at another point, or the berries come. That's why people were moving. They were moving with animals, but they were also following the crops that would come up at that time naturally. If you can imagine like a vine growing, and then you might go and pick a couple of them, and then you move on, and that vine continues to grow, and there's squash there, and then it's cooler, or whatever the case may be, and you're coming back through, and that vine has died, but the pumpkin's still sitting there. So, and the seeds are big, so this would be something that you could pick up as food on your way back, and then save the seeds from and plant. So, one of the oldest cultivated crops in the North American continent. There's 5 main species of it, of course, native in Mesoamerica. They were amazing. They were masters of agriculture. So introduced to Spain and Italy first in the Columbian Exchange, because that southern, the Iberian Peninsula, it's very warm and lovely there, and so they were able. It doesn't really freeze often, so they're able to have a really long growing season. So grown for the flesh and the seeds. The seeds, like we've all had. Ever had pepitas before? That's the inside of a pumpkin seed. So you can roast pumpkin seeds and those are good, but even if you open up an acorn squash or a butternut squash, all of those are edible. And they're full of protein and antioxidants, and especially omega-3 fatty acids, which are really hard to get in the diet. That is a whole other talk. Would love to have the lipids and fats talk with you one day. That one is also very interesting. Okay, in 1620, the English colonists were gifted pumpkins by the Wampanoag, and initially they didn't like them when they first got there, and I think they were like, I don't like them, Mom. And then it got really cold that winter, and then they had to eat them, and then they ended up loving them because it's better than starving. Also, this tribe showed them how to hollow it out and put in milk and honey and spices and bake it in the coals of a fire. And then it was like, oh my gosh, can you imagine? That would be so delicious. You just spoon it right out. But that's where like the first pumpkin pie came from. But they had no flour or butter or anything at that time because they had been there for a little while and they were out of food. And if it wasn't for this tribe, they would have died. So summer squash, they are pumpkins of sorts. But when we harvest a summer squash, it's got the seeds are not mature, so you eat the whole thing. If you wanted to save seeds for that, you just leave it on the vine and it will die back and that hard squash will be there. Now people, this happens all the time, around October 16th, someone will call me and say, I want to grow winter squash for my kids because I want them to have a pumpkin. And I'm like, talk to me next June. And then I give them a pumpkin because they're called winter squash because you can store them over the winter. They're this storage vessel of starch and protein through the seeds. And so, all of these crops are not just, lettuce is great, but it's not that interesting because you can't really store it for the long term. The stuff that's really has made it over time and really changed in its format the most over time are the things that store for long periods of time. Okay. All right, there's someone's rendition of the first Thanksgiving. Okay. Old world cucumbers. Okay, so native to India, cultivated for over 3,000 years. A lot of the firsts of things are not as delicious as they are now. Like for instance, cucumbers were probably pretty bitter when we first started eating them. They were popular in ancient Egypt for food and liquor. So in Egypt, what they would do is they'd take a cucumber, not hollow it out, but just take the top off, muddle up the inside, cap it, and bury it for a few days, and it made like a beer, basically. basically. It was a fermented liquid. And if you can believe it, in the Fertile Crescent, or in Egypt between the Tigris and Euphrates and, you know, the whole flooding and the grain that they would grow, all their grain stores, half of it was for bread, the other half was for beer. Does anybody know why people drank so much beer? Safer than water, that's right. Because the water, you know, a lot of times people you know, you use it for cooking and things, but you're not gonna just like drink out of the Euphrates, because people are also using it to sail in, wash their clothes, use the restroom. Like it could end up being pretty messy, and so for it to be cleaner, they would make beer. And that's also how they ended up making sourdough. Like you could make your bread in one bowl, and then just every time you made it in the bowl, it would rise on its own because the yeast is in the air, but it's also like becomes part of the bowl. And all the clay pots that you would make beer in. Okay. Introduced to Europe by the Greeks and Romans, this diva right here, Tiberius, he loved cucumbers so much that he had people put them in planters, and wherever he went, these planters had to go with him, so he had a constant crop of them. And if he went somewhere cold, they actually constructed like these silica cold frames. So I don't know if you've ever seen mica, like where it's that rock that you can like peel pieces off of it, like the earliest windows. That's basically what his people made for him, so because he had to eat them every day. So he's very high maintenance. But you know, if you're an emperor, as is your right, I guess. So this comes up a lot. It's mentioned in the Bible in Exodus by Israelites fleeing Egypt. So I saw this passage like 10 times. I don't know it by heart, but it was basically the Israelites were leaving Egypt, and they had received manna from heaven, and they had eaten the manna from heaven for a while and were getting a little tired of it. And they said something to the effect of like, oh, I remember in Egypt when we can eat all that fish. And then it said like 6 old world crops, one after another. It was like onions, garlic, cucumbers, like it mentioned like 5 or 6 of them. Like, oh, those must all be old world then. That's gonna be foreshadowing. But then I forgot to write it here. So it comes up when it's like, it's in the Bible, it's in the Bible. It's pretty much that one passage, except for cilantro is in another passage. So Charlemagne and King Henry ate them daily during their reigns. It was actually Catherine of Aragon, King Henry VIII. I think that was his first or second wife. I can't keep track. He had so many firsts. Yeah, before he beheaded her. She wanted them on the dinner table every single night. So that was one of her favorite vegetables. Columbus introduced them into Haiti in 1494. That was the first place that they grew in the New World. And Spanish sailors brought them to Florida in 1539, and you know they had to take off there because it's Florida and it's beautiful and tropical, and they probably could grow like a perennial basically there because it never freezes, especially if it's like down in the Miami area. In 1806, they were growing in American colonial gardens, and Heinz was really the one that made them like pickles for days. Everybody had pickles, especially in like the 1930s to 1950s, where everybody was eating like meat and potatoes all the time. It was like meat, potatoes, and pickles. People didn't really eat a lot of vegetables before. And so you know, there you go. Burpless cucumbers mean that they don't have a lot of cucurbitacin, and this molecule here actually is also the one that when it gets really hot, this will become, your cucumbers become bitter and they taste terrible. That's because this chemical right here is like going up. There are a couple of like, I love growing Armenian cucumbers. They're not for everyone, but they're basically a gourd. But you pick them young and they're delicious, and they're Armenian, so it can get like 100 degrees outside and they don't go bitter. So they don't have a gene that creates a lot of this. But that's also what causes you to burp. So, all right. But I remember seeing burpless cucumbers, and I'm like, do cucumbers really make people burp? Is that like a real problem for people? That was a long time ago, before I was a big time gardener. Okay, muskmelons. So this is old world. In the Middle East, they were like the experts in melon production for sure. I wanted to say really quick, just as a culinary note, and that's all the way down here, climacteric. That is something that ripens after you pick it. Like the best example is a banana. You pick that thing green and chewy and hard and totally unpalatable, and it starts to, just by nature, put off ethylene gas. and the more ethylene gas that's in its environment, the faster it will ripen. That fruit is climacteric. Anything that you get and it just kind of gets softer and changes, and gets sweeter over time before it starts to rot, that's a climacteric fruit. And these are called muskmelons because they smell musky and good. When, you know it's ripe because you can smell it, and it smells like a cantaloupe or a honeydew. There's many other kinds, though. Canary melons, fill in the blank. Watermelons are not climacteric. You got to pick them ripe or they're no good. So, they're good for certain things, but they're not good for, you can use the rind to make stuff. But if you pick a watermelon unripe, it's never going to be great. So most likely Persia or the Horn of Africa is where this started, and those two areas are very close together. But the center of diversity for these is really spread out. And you can guess, because to eat them, you pull the seeds out, and I'm sure it was so easy to dry them and trade them around. Greeks consumed them in 3rd century BC. Pliny the Elder included writings about them when they got to Campania, and Campania was actually like the main island in Britain. It was like the northern side of it during the Roman times. They called that Campania. And he found a melon over there and was like, what is this? Something's happening in Campania. That's what he said. Okay. Columbus carried seeds on his second voyage, probably to Florida, or near there, and it went up to Florida. But indigenous tribes in Florida, Midwest, and New England grew them by the 1600s, so it spread pretty quickly because you stick these in the ground and they just take off. As long as there's water and it's hot, these will grow. Almost all, like we were saying before, where these are native and where they grow the best is where you have rain some of the time, but there's drying out in between, and it's really, really sunny because this is a fruit. It's a big, juicy, sweet fruit, and in order to make something like this, you need a lot of sunlight. Also, you don't need too much moisture because these vines are susceptible to downy mildew because they're on the ground and they're kind of crowded on top of each other. So California's Imperial Valley, it's dry as a bone and they irrigate. So, growing crops out there, as long as you have water, which artificially you basically have to pull it out of the ground or take it from the Colorado River, as long as you have a constant source of water, it's a great place to grow crops. Because in the West, there aren't any bugs, there's no blight, it's not moist enough for a fungus to grow on anything. So it's pretty great, but so many people live there. I left because it doesn't rain enough, and that scares me that there's a million people there and there's no water. Watermelons, totally different species. Definitely native to Africa. Really hard to tell center of origin because it just ubiquitous cultivation all across Africa. Mainly because it's a vessel of water. So initially this was a bitter little seedy melon that probably was not that sweet and delicious, but the fact that you can harvest these melons, if it rains infrequently, these guys will suck up moisture like nobody's business, and then you can store them kind of laid out in a shady area for weeks, and you have this store of water. So they're really popular to take on voyages because if you don't know if you're going to be around water for a while, you basically have this like vessel of clean water that you can drink. So that's why they were popular to begin with. Also, it could be that the agouti melon, it may have been a common ancestor for this. Agouti soup or stew is still very popular in West African cuisine. You can actually buy agouti melon seeds in an African grocery store. They look just like watermelon seeds, and they're really rich in, actually even now if you eat watermelon seeds, it's going to be the healthiest part of the watermelon. It's got protein, just like any other seed does, protein. It's going to have omega-3 fatty acids. It's basically like eating a seed. So these are very good for you. Libyans and Egyptians grew them 5,000 years ago, and in King Tut's tomb, there's actually paintings of watermelons, he comes up a couple of times. They really did, food's important anyway, but the fact that it shows up, I can't remember which crop was actually like painted on the wall of a I think it was a melon, but it was painted on the walls of a brothel in Pompeii when they dug it up. Like, people paint, in all kinds of tombs, melons, not just King Tut's tomb, but there were other tombs that had watermelons painted on the inside. And he was also buried with them as well, because he was going to have to travel a long distance. In their belief system, when you're buried with like your pets and your clothes and your chariot and your servants. Like, you were buried with all of these things and literal people because you were going to go on a journey into the underworld and you needed supplies to get there. So watermelons, that he was going to need water to drink, so they left them in there with him.
Cheryl, excuse me, so you can dry the seeds and eat them?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You can eat them fresh. You can eat them dry. You can, yeah.
They're kind of bitter, the seeds I've had in watermelon.
Yeah, because they're not grown for the seeds.
Oh.
But you can roast them or you can just eat them. You can chew them. Yeah.
Cool.
We're just used to eating the watermelon. We didn't select for the seeds, whereas, you know, in African culinary tradition, they have selected for the seeds because
Yeah.
that's, you know, they make stews and flour and things like that out of it.
Yeah.
Asian countries eat watermelon seeds for their Lunar New Year.
Oh, they do?
You can buy it.
Did you hear that, everybody?
For the New Year.
Yeah, Lunar New Year. Asian countries won't eat them. I did not know that. Do they roast them first?
I don't know, but it's very rarely available. We eat as snacks.
Awesome. Okay. I learned something today. Yeah, so like this is, so, you know, we've selected for the flesh of it, but lots of cultures they didn't waste any part. So just by the time it got to us, we could select for like more of a dessert kind of taste. But other cultures recognize the nutritional quality of seeds in all things. Let's see. Okay, so Egyptians are credited with breeding the sweet varieties, and some of the older writings will have like white flesh or yellow flesh when they were still bitter, and apparently this red gene is connected to the gene for sweetness, and so as they got sweeter, the flesh got more red. And in fact, one thing, let's see, is it on here? I don't think I put it on here, but actually, in Jewish tradition, which is really interesting, like Orthodox people have a prayer for every type and classification of food. So if it's bread, there's a prayer for bread, there's a prayer for meat, there's a prayer for all different kinds of food that they'll say before they consume that particular food. And in yeshiva, they actually, I think it's adorable, they actually like test kids on, if I was going to eat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, what were the prayers that I would do? Because all of those foods, they have certain prayers that go with each one. And so what's interesting is they tithe, so they give a tenth of what they make to the church. And at this time, before people were necessarily, like, they were tithing food. And so in their historical writings, I think it was like in like the 13th or 14th century, they listed watermelons in the same category of tithing as pomegranates, figs, and grapes, which were all desserts and sweet at that time. So if this was bitter, this would have been like in a vegetable category or something. So it didn't specifically say this is sweet, but you would do the same prayer for this as you would for a pomegranate. So I thought that was really cool. It transported a lot. Okay, so trade of enslaved Africans introduced watermelon to South America and Florida pretty early on because this was native to Africa. And it was very much used in Western African culinary tradition. The seedless varieties, and she could speak more to this, I read about it and I'm like, ooh, that's gonna be an Ashley question, but there's like a diploid and a tetraploid, and they breed them and it makes a triploid seed, and triploids are sterile, and so when you grow with that triploid seed, you get a seedless watermelon. But this, I think, I'm telling you, Koreans and Japanese people are masters of cultivating melons. I mean, we're talking thousands of dollars for melons. I'm completely fascinated. These are probably only $100 a piece to grow them like this, but they will like cultivate these melons in these like shaded houses or greenhouses and like pet them and cover them in a certain way, and they pull off, there's like one vine that makes one melon, and it's like a complete status symbol, but it's also like I can't even speak to authority about it. I just watched the videos about it, about them cultivating melons. There's also a certain kind of grapes that's like thousands of dollars a pound, and they're prized. It's completely fascinating. But this is just like an adorable subset of that. But look it up, like look up some YouTube videos on like these extremely high priced thousands of dollar watermelons that, I mean, like if I had all the money in the world, I would totally buy one. If I hit the lotto, that would be on my bucket list, because I mean, what does a $2,000 watermelon, I mean a $2,000 like Crenshaw melon taste like? It has to be like I think all melons would probably be dead to me after tasting something like that. So let's see. Okay, I think we got through all the information there. I thought this was so sweet. This was like during the Renaissance times, but this was to show that even in this art, by then this watermelons were sweet because they were red at that point. So, and it even says melones dulces, sweet melons. Okra. Okay. Obviously, this is in the hibiscus family, so I'm sure you're going to learn this during botany if you haven't had that class already. If you want to know if plants are related, just see if their flowers look alike. So we're going to pick up the pace a little bit because I only know we have 30 more minutes. We have a couple more categories. So either native to the Congo and Angola regions or Eritrea and Ethiopia, and these regions are in a little bit of argument about that. So, so we've got here and here arguing as to where it started, but really if you look in that centers of domestication of plants, there's like this little road that goes through here. So, so anyway, yes, arguing here and here is like which one, where okra came from, but I mean, it's awesome, so regardless of where it came from. Okay, so in Bantu languages, it's called ngobo, and so we've anglicized that to gumbo. Grown by Egyptians and Moors in 12th and 13th century and spread to Europe in the 14th century. And so this was like very hard to read. So it's brought to America, of course, sometime in the 16th or 17th century by enslaved Africans. And it was grown in Brazil by the 1680s because in the initial trade, everybody went to Brazil first, and then as we started to move up into North America, enslaved Africans started to come up there. But African women would braid seeds into their hair so that when they came across, they're for like hoping for sovereignty on land. Because it wasn't just that, you know, it wasn't like the Dutch people showed up and were like, you, and you come with me. There was actually huge wars going on because when some of the Western tribes figured out, hey, if I can go pick a fight with that group over there and come up with some people, then I can trade for rum, I can trade for guns, I can trade for foodstuffs. So there were a lot of warring factions going on in Africa as well. So it was just a hugely painful history. But this was happening all over, and so whether they did this when they were kidnapped initially or when they were put on the Middle Passage, this was like a very interesting and beautiful yet horrible thing to read, that they would braid them into their hair. And I'm a big braider too of my own hair, and so that, you know, and I braided like flowers and stuff in my hair, but this was a whole other level. The mucilaginous center, when you break it open, some people don't like okra because of that gooey schmooey center. That is actually, if you cook it quickly with high heat, that will dry it out really fast, which is why frying it is really good. Frying is technically a high heat, dry cooking method. But it's really good for you. You can also just coat them in a little bit of oil and stick them in like a super hot oven, and that same thing will happen. It's almost like eating shishito peppers, like roasted shishito peppers. But that gooiness actually feeds your gut flora. It's a prebiotic. It feeds your good gut flora, and it reduces your blood cholesterol. So if you can eat it, do. It's good for you. But the reason that the name gumbo that was anglicized to gumbo, the French settlers also participated in the trade of enslaved Africans. They actually were the ones that popularized this. So like Creole gumbo, they used this, even though it's a dish, it was thickened with okra. So that's why the dish was named that. If you want to sprout these, and there's a lot of different kinds, they're really beautiful. I mean, look at that, oh my gosh. That's technically an orange okra, it's a Jing orange okra. And this is a Clemson spineless, and that's I can't remember the name of that red one. The seeds are really hard. You have to really like okra to grow it because you have to go out and you have to harvest it every day. Like if you let one grow 5 or 6 days and it gets this big and dry and the seeds are starting to get dry, what that tells the plants is, okay, I did my job, I have my seeds for the next generation, and it will stop producing okra. So you gotta go out there and you only get like 2 or 3 or 5 okra a day off of one, so you gotta grow a lot of them. I like the dwarf varieties because they only get about that tall. If you grow a regular variety, it'll be like 12 or more feet tall, and you have to grab it and like bend it. But if you love okra, you should grow it. It's a beautiful plant. Just make sure you know that it's going to be like a Christmas tree and it's going to shade everything else. So put it kind of on the, the north side. So that you have a south-facing garden, you put it on the north side. All right, sweet potatoes. Okay, so amazing, delicious. Look at that variety, and there's way more than that. We also have a sweet potato lab. It is not a yam. Look, my little arrow didn't show up. That is an African yam, okay? Totally different crop. People are like, I like candied yams. I'm like, you've never really had a candied yam because you've never had this before. This you cook in a completely different way. The fiber in this will blow your mind. You gotta boil it for a long time and then you can mash it or fry it, or this is actually like a beautiful thing to eat. It's just not a sweet potato. So they're cultivated for 5,000 years in Central and South America. We're gonna talk, it was grown in Polynesia before European contact. I'm going to show you real quick on the map right there why that means something. Columbus brought it to Spain, English settlers brought it to the colonies, and Native American tribes may have been growing them already because of some trade. The leaves can be eaten as well as the tuber. So if you've got, I recommend these to school gardens. If people put a school garden in, they can have a little party in May when the kids leave and they can even take a tuber and start the starts in the classroom and then plant them as they leave, and then no one's around the garden during the summer, so why put in the tomatoes and cucumbers if no one's going to be there to take care of them? These choke out the weeds, and when you come back in the fall, the kids get to dig them all up, which is really great. Yeah?
How do you, I eat the leaves, but I don't get as many sweet potatoes, so what's the balance?
So if you eat like a lot of leaves, you won't get as big of a tuber just because those leaves are solar panels that need, the more of them there are, the more tubers they can make. I think if you plant them a little bit farther apart and you have more room, you'll have more tubers and leaves and you'd get sick of eating them. There'd be so many. So, yeah, but they're nice because they choke out weeds and you're not even supposed to water them. You water them when you put them in and then you just leave them alone and let them do their thing. So, let me show you this little argument in research right now, which I think is really interesting. So, this is where they started, okay? And then we've got Polynesia way over here. Like, Australia is almost closer to here than to the western coast of this. So when the explorers were coming over, they're like, oh wow, look at that, so delicious, sweet potatoes, we're gonna take them back. And then later on, researchers came here, and they've been growing them for thousands of years. And what they have guessed is that some of these folks came over on outrigger canoes and visited these guys and picked up sweet potatoes and brought them back and grew them, which I believe because I lived here for years and I sailed around a lot on those double outrigger canoes. And how do you think all those people got to all these islands on those canoes? So if they went from here to here and made new populations, this is not that far of a sail to come over and get crops and do trade. Like some of the most adventurous people, I mean, this is wide ocean. It looks so small on this map, but it's so much space in between, like absolute fearlessness to just, it's not like a ship where you can like walk downstairs and be dry and like make something to eat. It's just basically two canoes with a deck in between and a upside down sail basically. And so anyway, I believe it's probably this, but there are researchers arguing about how that could possibly happen, that they would have sweet potatoes before we did even. Okay. We're cranking. All right, we got 20 more minutes. Okay, this is the range. Moving past it. Okay, these are all old world. They almost have the same story, so we're going to rip through them pretty quickly. Parsnips, carrots. This is celeriac, which is celery, but the root or like underground stem is more developed. If you've never had that, it is like celery flavor. It's very, very good. Cilantro. Look at that pink celery. Can you even, so gorgeous. That is pink celery, Chinese pink celery. Regular Utah celery and parsley. You can see these are all related, not only because of their flowers, but their leaf type. Like they have the same leaf arrangement. When you see their flowers, I can't pronounce, it's like umbelliferae. Is that right? Yeah, umbelliferous, basically like umbrella. Like I always read it but never pronounce it, so then I get up in front of people and I'm like, blah, 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 I don't know. So, but Apiaceae. These are cool season old world crops. They almost all developed around Persia. So dry, beautiful, and they're domesticated in Asia because it's spread all over the place. They actually started out purple or yellow in color, and this orange color was developed way later. So they were consumed in 12th century Europe, but the writings are a little bit confusing because parsnips and carrots were kind of called the same thing. But parsnips were more popular, they were more frost tolerant, and you could dig them up in the middle of the winter outside. They mainly used them for oil seeds. Of course, they spread across China the 12th century, came to Japan during some sort of conquest around the 15th or 16th century. There's a popular rumor that this orange was developed for William of Orange during the celebration. Nobody thinks that's really true, but definitely the Dutch think it's true. And then, of course, pilgrims, when they came over to our country, they brought the seeds with them. It's a biennial plant. Most of the ones in this family are, and it takes 2 years to make seeds. Ooh, come on. So same kind of story on this one. Traveled around, our diva Emperor Tiberius loved these. And because different areas in the periphery of the Roman Empire required to pay tribute or they'd come and attack you, sort of like the mob, like that's a nice shop you have here, would it be terrible if something happened to it? That's kind of like how tribute worked for, like they were like, okay, they'd come through and they'd say, okay, we won't totally destroy your town here if you pay us, basically. So one of his big tributes every year was he would get tons and tons of parsnips. And the Celts, when they did their conquests in the east of them, they planted them along the Rhine in Germany. They didn't even need to really plant them. This is an aggressive naturalizer. You grow these once. The seeds do have the ability to shatter. They have the ability to take flight. And so that's why it's really hard to tell exactly where they started, because wherever they've been planted, they just renaturalize themselves as soon as they want to. So let's see. So General John Sullivan, we know that Native Americans were cultivating these at one point because in 1779, General John Sullivan had destroyed a camp of Native Americans and had destroyed a store of parsnips. So when these came over, there was a sharing of seeds between American settlers and Native Americans, and he documented destroying their food source, which is awful, but he wrote it down and we're talking about it today. So sweetness was really hard to get. If you think about it, before, when white sugar, or even sugar in general, was available, that was for the very, very rich, especially white sugar. That was the pinnacle, and it didn't even come granulated. You had to break it off of a chunk to make a cake or something. And so when you would have sweetness is in the summer, if you could get your hands on some honey, which few people could because there were beekeepers, but that is a very expensive thing. You could have fruit in the summer. But when the summer fruits were gone and it was the winter time, you could dig these up, and if you cook these slowly, the starches break down into shorter chains of carbon chains, and shorter carbon chains are sweeter. And so they would cook these down into cakes and things like that, and it would give you an element of sweetness in the wintertime that you wouldn't otherwise have available to you. Celery, and they have white celery too. Oh my gosh. China, they're old world, the agriculture game was on point. Just some of the diversity in some of their crops is awesome. So same story, native to Mediterranean, wherever the seeds shattered, it grew all over Europe. It used to just be consumed for the leaves. Lavage and dill are in this same category. Pretty much everything in this category they used for the seeds first, kind of like caraway or anise. All of those are in this same family. We didn't have this kind of time. That's why this could be an entire semester. They all have the same flowers, and primarily they use the seeds first. Then they went for the leaves, but then over time, especially with celery, if you eat celery leaf and a flat leaf parsley, the taste is not that different. But over time, they developed the stalk so that it was actually could be eaten as a vegetable. One last thing. Old world, they used to blanch celery, not dipping it in boiling water, but you can still get this actually at Reading Market in Pennsylvania, where when the celery grows, they'll pile dirt up around the developing stalks, and so it stays white because it's sequestered from light, so it can't photosynthesize, and so it becomes kind of squirrely looking, but it tastes very much like the inner pieces that are all tender and not too celery, like they're not as fibrous. This is the same way they do white asparagus. They just bury it. It's green asparagus that's been buried while it's been growing. It's the same plant.
What, do you have any idea why some celeries are just so bitter? I mean, and others are sweet, they taste like celery, I mean,
Well, age of the plant will have something to do with it. Also, if it was harvested, it was really hot outside. Any kind of like bitter flavors like that are usually because it's trying to fend off some sort of bug, you know, really. Which is why like collards, which we're gonna get into in a minute, are always better after a frost
Yeah.
because they're sweeter, they're more delicious, they have less of those like bitter chemicals, which they make more when it's hotter, but they make more when it's hotter to try to fend off the cabbage looper, which are those sweet looking little butterflies that you should kill every single one of them that you can find. Exactly. You'd be like, that's so beautiful, look at the yellow butterfly. Like, yeah, don't let a Girl Scout see you do that, it will break her little heart. Okay, parsley, same story. It moved all around, they used it for the seeds, but I thought it was really funny. Medieval British people really had some major opinions. And you could tell modern sex education was not available at the time because it had a lot to do with fertility. So in medieval British, they had a lot of beliefs about it. Fried parsley brings a man to his saddle and a woman to her grave. If a woman of childbearing age plants parsley, she'll be pregnant before it germinates. I mean, it takes like 2 weeks to germinate, but I mean, still. If you plant too much parsley near your house, you will only birth girls. You will not have any boys. Parsley only flourishes if it's grown by a witch. Never give parsley as a gift lest the recipient become ill and bring bad luck. And babies are born by being dug up from parsley beds using golden shovels. I know. Okay, we're going to skip on because I only got 15 more minutes. Okay, so same kind of story with this one. It's a little bit more interesting though because like coriander is the seed to cilantro. We call it cilantro because we're closer to Mexico and that's what Mexican culture calls it, cilantro. But coriander leaf is what the rest of the world pretty much calls it. So if you've never ground fresh toasted coriander, you are missing out. It is the most delicious thing. I would never buy it pre-ground, like toast it and grind it. But yeah, I happen to love coriander leaf, but some people think it tastes like soap. And we'll talk about that. So oldest record found in Nahal Hamar cave in Israel, this very, very old cave kind of in mid-Israel on the eastern coast. And in King Tut's tomb, there was something like kilograms of this, of jars of this. Like it was obviously used very heavily in Egypt. Ubiquitous in old world cuisines, introduced to the Americas by the 17th century. The most important thing is, who in here thinks it tastes like soap?
who here and here what?
That tastes like soap. So there's a genetic reason that this tastes like soap to some people. It's usually in women, that it's more likely in women, more likely in European, less likely in African American, Latinx, East and South Asians are less likely to detect the soapiness. But for all of you who are like, I love cilantro, I don't know what they're talking about, wait till the thing starts to bolt. When it starts to put off flowers, so try to put off coriander, go and eat a few of those leaves, and you will taste it. It is nasty. Because more of these aldehydes are being produced at that time because it's hotter. Don't go to a spring plant sale in May and buy cilantro because cilantro and basil have exactly opposite growing. Like as soon as your cilantro is bolting, that's when your basil goes in. And when your basil is bolting, putting off flowers and seeds, that's when your cilantro goes in. They have exactly opposite schedules. So anyway, one interesting thing, there could be some epigenetic modifiers of taste, as in, like there's some evidence that what women eat when they're pregnant affects the taste that their child will have when they're born, which I thought was fascinating. Yes?
So, cilantro is big in both Asian and Western cultures. Did it simultaneously develop in those two regions, or did it move across the Silk Road?
Totally moved across. So this is Old World, and it followed the same like Persia and all around, spread across Asia and Africa. We brought it over, and then it started in South America, quickly moved up through Mexico. And so, you know, we were talking about this the other day, that like, is it an exposure thing? Even in this study, they didn't know, is it an exposure thing? That like you're exposed to it enough from a very young age that could be like an epigenetic factor of, I don't taste that, like these genes are not expressed to be able to taste these aldehydes as much. Or is it that it is truly genetic and you're gonna sense it and it's gonna be awful? So, yeah, okay, we're gonna crank through this. Okay, we're gonna go real quick through this. This is my favorite family. I love me some brassicas. If you're gonna start vegetable gardening and you think you're terrible at it because you couldn't grow a tomato, ooh, honey, start with some collards. You will be successful, I promise you. Okay, so you won't be tested on this information, but Brassica oleracea, this is all of your favorite brassicas, the European ones, or mine anyway, broccoli, cauliflower, kohlrabi, collards, kale, you name it, all of those is this guy, and these are like common ancestors. This guy over here is all your Asian brassicas, tatsoi, gailan, bok choy, Chinese cabbage, that's that one. And then they combine, and that's canola oil. So canola is actually rapeseed. That's a terrible name, but rape is the name of like this class of green vegetables and oilseed producing plants. It's called canola oil now because they wanted to sell it as a food oil in the 80s, and no self-respecting lady of the 80s is going to buy rape oil and cook their food. So they named it Canada Oil Canola. Anyway, we're not going to worry about any of these. We're going to talk about those two real quick because I know you got to go. I'm not going to keep you here late.
Rutabaga's brassica too, right?
Yeah. Rutabaga is actually in that same family. Rutabaga is in the middle with canola. So I'm glad you mentioned that. Okay, so this is not exhaustive, but this is my favorite one, Romanesca. Oh my God, it's so beautiful. It's like an edible toy. Okay, I call this the puppy of the vegetable world because if you think about it, a Great Dane and a Chihuahua are the same species. Okay, same with that. I mean, and this isn't even all the diversity in this. This is just all I could fit on here as fast as I could. Okay, so this has intrigued researchers and Darwin because it's the same species and it's manipulated just a little bit, and it gives you can select for all kinds of things. So it may have started with the collard-like plant in the Horn of Africa. So how we were looking, if you look at the Horn of Africa up there on the northeast, like the Middle East is so close. And also just chasing around the top into Libya and Egypt, you're already at the Mediterranean. And I mean, these seeds and their ancestors are everywhere. So it's very difficult to tell. And their seeds are really small, so they can be picked up by the wind and kicked over to the next area. Yeah, we'll keep moving on. I know we don't have a lot of time. So migrated across the Mediterranean basin, mentioned in Greek and Latin literature. And so we looked at that map of the Roman Empire. The common ancestors of these are all around there. Sicily especially. Sicily, because it's got all those rocky outcroppings, has tons of different kinds of Brassica oleracea just growing randomly all over the place. Collards, sukama in Swahili, were cultivated for thousands of years throughout Africa. So this is just a common vegetable in all of the diets all the way across the African continent. So, this is one of the reasons enslaved Africans brought seeds for collards directly over with them because it was one of the few things. They grew crops for themselves and, of course, for the landowners and their owners. And this was one of the only crops that they were allowed to grow and harvest and cook for themselves. There were very few. Okra, collards, very few. Even to the point that like almost all the time out here in the South, because it was so hot and also because we didn't have like modern systems of, the fireman wouldn't come to your house, there was an outdoor kitchen. And so you did all your cooking outside in another, because if it caught on fire, you would burn your whole house down. So there was always an outdoor kitchen. And things were being cooked out there in order to bring the food from the kitchen to the house enslaved Africans had to whistle the whole time to prove that they weren't eating anybody's food. Yeah, absolutely true. There's you should read The Cooking Gene. I can't remember I almost brought that book for you. I read it so long ago. That's excellent. There's also a lot of cultural sites around here where you can learn about this stuff. And they've got like a lot of really interesting booklets and cookbooks and factoids and all kinds of things. So lots of like fascinating. If you're new to this area, you should definitely tour all of those sites. I think they're free. So anyway, this is definitely some of the seeds that they brought with them because they could grow and cook for themselves. Cabbages arrived later, broccoli and cauliflower. Just to let you know, Italians, I mean, anything they touch in this Brassica oleracea world, they were the ones that really selected for inflorescences. These are all Italians doing right here. So they just, I don't know what they are with flowers, but they're real good at it. And also they did some of these, like, if you leave these and they make seeds and they catch off somewhere else, they'll just genetically recombine and make something else out of themselves. So we can select for certain things, but it will convert to a wild type. It's almost like a parsnip in that way. It'll find its way and go live in a field somewhere just as happy as can be. Okay, Asian brassicas. We're gonna rock through these. Okay, we know these. Turnips, bok choy, tatsoi, gailon, mizuna. This is my favorite one, mizuna, if you've never grown this. It's a mustard you can eat raw. So delicious. I really like the green variety. There might be seeds for it out there. Bok choy is the most ancient variety ever developed. Chinese cabbage is only over the last 600 years. So mizuna's Chinese origin, but so many of those ended up in Japan because of their conquests in Japan. So a lot of the same vegetables are grown. Plus they're also very, very close to each other. Alexander the Great recorded samples of Brassica rapa. His empire included much of the Fertile Crescent. Rutabagas were developed for B. napus. You brought that up. We call them Swedes because they were very popular in Swedish. But yeah, rutabagas, turnips. Yeah, they are very good. Sulforaphanes, which are the pepperiness, which is why a lot of people don't like broccoli or cauliflower stuff. There's this paper that has phenolphthaleocarbamide on it. I need to buy a little thing of that paper. I used to have some at my old job whenever I would do talks about this family of vegetables. Some people can taste these bitter flavors, and some people cannot. And if you have two parents that can both taste these flavors, you're considered a super taster if you get 2 copies of that gene, and this family of vegetables will be like, ugh, to you. Remember how Ronald Reagan back in the day wouldn't eat broccoli? He's probably a super taster. Like he couldn't do it. So some kids, that's why you never force feed a kid anything, but definitely not this family of vegetables, because you can develop a taste for bitter over time. But some people, probably I would say, maybe half the room when you taste this paper, it will taste like nothing. And so the bitter flavors in these vegetables you won't even pick up. But then there's some people like, I'm not a taster, I love this class of vegetables, but I tasted it and I was like, oh yeah, that's bitter. And then some people were like, ah, and they obviously had 2 sets of matching genes, and I just had the one. So, okay, lettuce. It only has 1 slide. Don't you wish all of them did this? Where every single one had a map? When I saw this, I'm like, oh, lettuce, you really had it figured out for me. So it started over here. It was pretty thorny, but they liked it. It's called lectuca because it, when you break it, like when you cut off the end of like a lettuce, it's got a milky kind of, and so they were bitter. That was like a bitter sap, and they were also thorny. But I mean, everybody figured out what was edible at one time or another. And then it moved through here, and then what I think is particularly interesting, I mean, they've covered up current day Italy. See how that says Kos? That you'll see seeds out there, Paris Island Kos. This is where romaine lettuce came from, was the Romans, where they, rather than this leafy, sweet little lettuce with thorns all over it, they actually developed it to be less bitter, no thorns, and have that upright growth habit. So, and then it went around and then probably came over, it definitely came over with settlers to the United States for sure. That's the end of lettuce. Okay, last one. Onions and garlic. I had to combine the 2 because I knew I'd be cutting it short. I will not move my army without onions, Ulysses S. Grant. Not only for food, but could you imagine you get shot, they pull the bullet out and they put a slice of onion on it? Like, this was like, it's not like antibiotics were readily available, so it was food, it was medicine, it was everything.
It also keeps vampires away.
Keeps vampires away, exactly. Especially with all of those potatoes that were grown by wild devils and witches. Wild onions and garlic are consumed since prehistoric time. Again, there's even wild onions that grow in our yards. You know, in the fall we go to mow your lawn and it smells like onions. I actually love that. When I first moved here, I was like, are there onions in our yard? My husband was mine. I'm like, it smells delicious out here. But anyway, yeah, so I just let them grow there because I think it's fascinating. But those are the kind of little wild onions that grew all over the place. They were buried in Egyptian tombs and their walls were painted with pictures of them, which I think was great. King Ramses IV was buried with them in his eye sockets. But this was really common back in the day to put onions in mummy bundles for what they were supposed to take with them, to put them in sockets of their body. You know, it was just something that they did. When antibiotics were unavailable, garlic was a pharmacy for historic cultures. Greeks fortified Olympic athletes they ate onions raw, drank the juice, and rubbed them all over their bodies before they went out to fight the lions or whatever they were doing. So onions and garlic were given as rent payments or wedding gifts in the Middle Ages. And European settlers brought onions with them on the Mayflower, one of the first crops that were planted in the colonies. One thing I want to talk about. So when we talk about people who are enslaved in the food system, this is going on now. And for every apple or pear or head of lettuce that you get, there's a lot of pain and work in that with people, a lot of times undocumented immigrants. But one thing that you can make a big change about today is do not buy pre-peeled garlic from China. Because it is peeled by hand by prisoners, some of them Uyghurs, who are a Muslim group that are being basically kind of worked to death. Hate to end it on a Debbie Downer moment, but I know that we all want to make good choices, and so just as a rule, but if it's cheaper and you got to feed a lot of people, I'm not here to judge you. But if you see pre-peeled garlic, as convenient as it looks, it's literally peeled by hand by people who have no choice to do it. So just want to let you know about that. Sorry to leave it on such a Debbie Downer, but if anybody has any questions, I'll stay after. So.